This is another episode of Rig Recon Live. I'm Bruce Quick alongside Jason Witmier. And before we get started today, let's go through some housekeeping items. Make sure you follow us on social media at Rig Recon. You can find us on Instagram and Facebook. You can get this podcast wherever you get your podcasts, including on YouTube. And then most importantly, visit our website, rigrecon.com, for all the latest apparatus content, including side-by-side comparisons, product breakdowns, product guides, and so much more. So without further ado, Jason, I'll kind of let you start today's topic and introduce the guest.
Thanks, Bruce. We are honored to be joined today by Mike Wilbur and Tom Shand, better known as the Apparatus Architects. And they've both been in the industry for a long time. I'm going to let both of them give their background and introduction because I would do no justice. I'm sure I would miss something important. But I just want to say on a personal note, years ago when I first started in the apparatus industry, we used to do a show in Baltimore called Firehouse Expo, and both Mike and Tom were a part of that. And we did, as part of that expo, we always did a podcast. And I was honored back then as a young guy starting in the industry to be a part of that podcast and get to speak on it. And now it's awesome that we've got Rig Recon running and we're able to have you guys join us today. So if you would each just go through your background quickly for our audience. I'm sure most of them know you, but just in case there's anything they don't know.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, so Tom Shand, briefly started my career in College Park, Maryland, while I was attending the university there in 1970. So as the folks say, do the math. I've been around for a while. Had a great run of working 32 years in the apparatus industry in different sales and engineering capacities. Most recently, just stepped away from doing 12 years of work with both the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps Fire and Emergency Services, being responsible for being part of a team that managed their apparatus fleet. With the Navy, had over 600 rigs, doing the apparatus specs, part of the team that did the bid reviews, pre-construction, and then final inspection. So a brief little background on myself. I've been doing fire apparatus photography for quite a while, and I introduce myself anymore to people who don't know me as I'm just a fire truck nerd. Would you pull your rig out so I can take some pictures?
Hi, and I'm Mike Wilbur. I'm a 40-year volunteer. I got started in 1974, and then I joined the New York City Fire Department in 1981, where I retired as a lieutenant. I worked on their apparatus committee, started this company called Emergency Vehicle Response, met Brother Shand in Firehouse Expo, believe it or not, back in the mid-90s. We met up. My daughter always said we were brothers from the different mothers, and has become my best friend. And we have worked in EVR doing apparatus specs, fleet evaluations, any kind of apparatus consulting, needs assessments, any kind of training for about, 25 or 30 years now, along with both of us writing for national magazines and going around speaking on various apparatus-related issues. And on a personal note with Jason and I go way back. We've actually presented together a couple times. And so thank you for the invitation. It's good to see you again, my friend, and glad to be on your podcast.
Awesome. So glad to have you guys here. Today's subject, we're going to dive in and talk about pre-construction conferences. And what's really funny is the pre-construction conference has changed so much over the course of time. It used to be pretty simple. You would go out to bid for a rig, and some people would loosely put together, hey, this is what we think we want. But then they'd wait until they got to that pre-construction conference, tour the factory, look at some other rigs in production. And sometimes what they would walk out from pre-con with is nothing like what they went to bid with. That existed for a while, probably throughout the 80s into the 90s, even into the early 2000s. Now, completely changed. And that's what we're going to dive into today is what's changed, what should you be looking at, what are the things you really should be considering. Before we do that, Bruce, go ahead. I know you've got a question to start us off before we dive into the pre-con.
Yeah, before we dive into that, let's maybe briefly talk about the spec process. And you both have a lot of history in this industry. With that, we could probably do an entire podcast on on the spec processing in general. But before we start with the pre-con stuff, maybe give us your top 3 things to consider when building your spec, maybe things to avoid or things that are overlooked, and stuff that can't be fixed at the pre-con moment.
Yeah, Bruce, really good question. I guess as Jason alluded to, not only the pre-construction conference, but the whole specking or purchasing process has changed quite considerably, not just in the last couple of years with some of the things going on within the industry, but probably going back 10 or 15 years when communities would utilize any one of the numerous nationally recognized consortium purchasing groups to order their fire truck with. And with that became, in my estimation, somewhat a diminishing of people actually writing a spec within the confines of the fire department. They would choose 1 or 2 vendors they would consider, maybe have a couple of meetings with their apparatus committee. But the days, again, other than large fleets, which have a great degree of standardization and specific components from the bumper to back step that they use, they will write their own spec and then have people say, what can you do to go meet these requirements? But a good majority of the number of the smaller volunteer departments, it's pretty rare anymore to find somebody that's actually writing their spec. So to get to your point, one of the issues becomes, or why the Reconstruction Conference becomes so vitally important, since they didn't write a spec and relied upon potentially their preferred vendor or vendors to work with them to develop the requirements, it kind of goes to what Jason said. Since the average fire truck spec coming back from a manufacturer is 100 pages plus, pick a number. Back when I started, a whole fire truck spec was maybe 40 or 45 pages. How do I know that? Because I started typing specs back in the day before word processors on a typewriter with carbon paper. And if you made a mistake on page 23, I don't know how many times I would have to retype page 23 until I finally got it right.
Maybe we should go back to that, Tom. That would shorten the specs today if we went back to that.
Oh, absolutely, because it goes, again, other than the folks that are, no disrespect to the people that buy a fire truck every couple of years, but that's where I see many of the issues being is these people, if they haven't bought a fire truck in 4 or 5 years, say prior to the pandemic, they're frankly naive, not their own fault, as to what the actual process is, when the pre-construction conference is going to occur from the time you sign the contract. And with most manufacturers anymore, it's not within 60 or 90 days after you initially sign the contract. So you have a great lag time between when the order is placed, when you're going to be doing the pre-construction conference. Think about what just happened that we all were out attending at the FDIC. So you ordered a vehicle back, say, November, fall of last year. You got it in under a price increase. The FDIC introduced some new products, both lighting, scene lighting, different things like that. And now you want to integrate those into your vehicle, and you get to the point of pre-construction, right away there's changes just because of changes and upgrades in the components and the materials. Not to say nothing of the fact, again, what Jason alluded to is the fact that people really weren't sure what they wanted. So they figured, well, let's at least get the rig on order and we'll figure it out at some point later on. That unfortunately is going to end up costing the department a lot of time in pre-construction. For the poor sales representative, an awful lot of time to capture all of these changes. And suffice to say, you're going to spend a lot more money at pre-construction. I had certain barometers that I used to be able to follow to say, at pre-construction, if we had to spend more than $4,000 to maybe $7,000 on changes, maybe just as a result of things that they saw that were new or that they hadn't thought about, we kind of failed in being able to define the rig right up front. And unfortunately, Mike and I have both been working with folks that, regardless of what the upfront price is, that they don't seem to be bothered at all by walking out of the pre-construction conference with a 15-page document and another $20,000 in cost. I'm like, God bless them, they can do that. But boy, that's not the way that I was brought up, or my expectations as to if you did your due diligence up front in defining the mission of the vehicle, what you wanted, and getting that rig pretty well dialed in before pre-construction. If you fail to do that, just know that your pre-construction conference, you're not going to do that in 8 or 10 hours, and you're not going to get out of there with $0.
Right. See, you could almost say that back in the day, we would judge the cost of a pre-con on the mistakes you made. So if you came out a pre-con with very little cost, that means you wrote a great spec. That's not true anymore. Go ahead, Mike. I'm sorry I jumped in on you there.
Yeah, no, that's fine, Jason. I think this goes back even way before the pre-con, and that is trying to design a vehicle that's going to fit the needs of your community and also going to fit the pocketbook of your community as well. There's a lot more financial pressure on fire departments, I think more than ever now, to try and get it right. So we have done a number of aerial needs assessments or apparatus needs assessments because town and city and village managers are not at all enthralled with having pre-construction conference bills of $20 or $30 or $40,000 anymore. That's just not going to cut it. And so that has put more pressure on the fire department to define that mission of the vehicle and to get it right from the start. And whether you do it yourself or you have people come in, a third party outside expert, so to speak, to talk with your city officials and say, this is what they need and this is how much it's going to cost. Because honestly, most city officials that we deal with now are just in complete sticker shock because the cost of a fire truck has literally doubled in the last 6 years. And so to kind of act as an intermediary in that discussion to say, yeah, no, these guys are not getting all the bells and whistles. They're getting what they need for the community, but unfortunately, with the shape of the apparatus industry right now, that's what the vehicle costs.
So let's jump to the pre-con itself a little bit. And something that I think there was a myth 20 years ago where fire departments thought, hey, we spend $500,000 on a fire truck and we get this free trip to go to maybe a nice place, depending on where your OEM is located, depending on the time of year. And it's a free vacation. We get to look at fire trucks. We get to lay our truck out and design it. Let's face the facts. You pay for that trip and you pay for every trip. And nowadays, most people break it down in the spec and show you that, hey, a pre-construction is going to cost this much, a midpoint trip, this much per person, a final, this much per person. If there's one trip that I personally think you absolutely cannot do without, it's the pre-construction. So if I'm looking to save money somewhere, the pre-con is somewhere that I would not cut out. And I think you guys will probably agree. And what I'd like you to expand on is in your experience, some of the things that happen at pre-con. What do you see at pre-con? What do you learn at pre-con? And why is that pre-con so important?
Can I start first? I think one thing is that people, due to COVID, kind of took the easy out and basically because of COVID and could do it remotely. And in my opinion, I think that is just a big mistake because there is just a lot lost in the process then. The idea of going to pre-con and saying, geez, I'd like a light by the rear tandems to light them up at night. And so what did we do? We went down to the assembly floor and found something of like and kind. And then the body engineer came with us and figured out that A, can it fit? And B, can we run electric current to it to get it to work? And you just can't do that remotely. So I think there's a lot of value in that trip. And I think it's easier on the salesman. I think it's easier on the vendor. I think it's easier on the apparatus committee so that you have an up-close, impersonal a meeting at the facility to agree or disagree on all these items. But anyway, get them worked out so that there's agreement so that nobody is shocked at the end of the build and have some very unhappy, salesmen, vendors, and or customers.
And just to be clear, I mean, your point is great. And you mentioned a time that we all went through. During COVID, you really didn't have the option because some of the factories said, you're not allowed to come here. But we're
That's
past
right.
that now, and
Right.
things have opened back up. And I think the point is that some people think, well, we did this during COVID. Why can't we just keep doing it remotely? Because you're losing something. And that's the point you're trying to make here, right, Mike?
Yes, absolutely. No question, Jason. And it could be costly. You know, you may pick up an error at the time of pre-con, or you may pick up something that you thought was there in the contract and it wasn't, or something like that. And so it just makes it a lot better. And I think Tom kind of holds the same opinion, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, the pre-construction conference to me is probably the most critical meeting that you're going to do face to face with the folks responsible for building your rigs. Your salesperson is probably, fully conversant as to what your thoughts were, your expectations are. But when you have the opportunity to go out to meet with the engineers in the different disciplines, whether it's chassis, cab, body, electrical, you get somebody that wants to detail, the layout of the pump panel. That's where the rubber meets the road, frankly, to be able to get that level of detail. And you just lose that when you have to do it remotely. I think most importantly, the group going out on the pre-construction, if at all possible, that group needs to be people that were hands-on with the design of the vehicle, with the different meetings, and that same assemblage of people, hopefully a nominal sum, we're not bringing 12 people to this meeting, are going to be the same group of people that go out to do the final inspection. So they were familiar and cognizant with the process as you went through. If you're dealing with the vendor and it's the first time you've bought from that manufacturer, you need to sit down with your salesperson before you make the travel arrangements and say, how does your company, how do you operate at the pre-construction conference, right? I think Mike's and my experience have been, for even a fairly, if there is such a thing anymore, it's a straightforward, and you need to allow at least a good day and a half for that. And if it's a complex aerial ladder that's got a lot of compartmentation or ground ladder banking requirements, you need to figure 2 days to be able to sit through and plow through all of that material. Chances are, sad to say, but Mike's and my experience has been, when you get to the point of pre-construction, very few people, unfortunately, in the committee, we're finding, have actually read through, let's say the whole long verbiage text spec was audited. Jason's already laughing because he knows where we're going. Have read through that spec. All right. They've looked at the blueprint. Hopefully there's one or two people, whether your vendor refers to it as the component list or the stripper. Different manufacturers work different in different ways. Some manufacturers will go through the long verbiage spec. Other people will go through the shortened, the anywhere from 10 to 18 page, call it component list. And then if there's a question, you need to go back and see what the long verbiage spec actually says. That, for your listeners, that's the tour of duty that you're signing up to, right? When you raise your hand and say, I do, and Uncle Sam sends you off, to your vocation and, in the military, you need to read all the details. And if you haven't read that 140 or 150 pages, that's exactly the verbiage with which the manufacturer is going to follow them. They're not going to put that spec on the floor. They're going to do a bill of materials. And again, if you can understand the manufacturing process that ahead of time, that will help you understand at the pre-construction conference. I've sat through ones that we've spent 4 hours on talking about dashboard layouts and switching arrangements. Well, we could have done that ahead of time before we went out to the manufacturing site. And then we find out we're in day 2 and we're due to fly out at 6 o'clock and it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And we're now finally on page 115 where we're in the pump panel. And that's where, You say, okay, well, how's this all going to work out? Where's the plumbing going? We're going to be able to meet with a pump engineer, and everybody's going to be looking at you saying, well, we got to be out of here in 2 hours, for the flight home. You need to become educated up front with how the manufacturer wants to go through that. If you have certain expectations, for Mike and I and the work we've done at EDR, it's things that we want to hit. The really important things up front is the weight analysis, all right? The proposed components that are going to hold this up. If you, the customer, have not supplied the factory with your equipment cache and the weight of your equipment, depending on the make and model of vehicle, the manufacturer is going to defer to the standard NFPA requirement. And for example, on a rescue engine, where it's going to be 2,500 pounds, my experience has been darn few rescue engines running around with 2,500 pounds of stuff. It's a lot more than that. And if you, the user, fail to tell the manufacturer what that number is and what you intend on carrying, then when you go to put the unit in service and you load it all up and go to weigh it and then find out, wow, we're 1,500 pounds overloaded on a rear axle. Who owns it? You, the fire department, own it because you failed to tell the manufacturer what you wanted to do. And those kinds of things, to go to Jason's original comment, critical at pre-construction. There's been pre-construction conferences where right away they're bringing in a chassis engineer, and I know, okay, we've got the right guy here. We're gonna talk about this even before we get 6 pages in and talk about the axles. Let's talk about that right now. And there's other times we're midway through day 2, and I'm like, hey, at what point are we going to be talking about, the weight analysis and the electrical load analysis and a few other things? And it'd be like, oh, well, the engineering will do that. Well, engineering does it after you leave. Now you're completely naive as to what the process is.
Tom, you touched on something that I think I'm going to bring back up because I don't think people realize it. And some firefighters, some of our listeners here are going to be really disappointed when they hear this. You as a consultant, people as firefighters in a small volunteer fire company may spend a year or two developing that, let's call it 150-page Bible on how that truck's going to be built. Here's the harsh reality. Nobody on the shop floor will ever see that spec. That is the job of the salesman and the engineering team at the OEM to translate all that work you put into that paper into what's going to get built on the floor. And that's the part that Tom and Mike are talking about here. At pre-con is where your only option, your only opportunity to make that connection and make sure that what you had in your mind when you wrote that paper is what you're going to see when you show up for a final.
Exactly. If you've got, just take again a standard engine and you've got a certain standard hose load that you've used for years in terms of 2 folds wide versus 3 folds wide on a 300 or a 400 foot line and different things like that. That kind of detail doesn't typically get laid in the specs. So the old adage is, if you're a salesperson, there's been pre-construction conferences I've sat through, and when you get to a certain point, the committee chairman will start to get exercised a little bit, and he'll look at the salesperson and says, well, you met us at the fire station. You saw our rigs. Your salesperson's not clairvoyant. He's not riding on your rig. He doesn't ride, if you could, I used to ride the back step back in the day. So you'd have the hose load memorized. Your salesperson, when that gets put into the spec, all right, and then hopefully recorded properly on the blueprint, one of my standard lines, because having worked in the industry, I designed innumerable Firetrucks. I got increasingly more successful in my later years. But one of my running jokes is everything I ever designed fit on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, right? And you'd see people, they'd look at the overall length of what they've told the salesperson they want. And I said, do you realize that the blueprint reads 34 feet, 7 inches. Your rig downstairs you're replacing, guys, is 31 feet. Other than the fact it's going to fit the firehouse, are you okay with that? And that'll be the first time I said, let's go down and let's go tape that off and see what that looks like. And unfortunately, again, Jason, you're spot on. In addition to the fact that people haven't read through that long verbiage document, in some cases, we've unfortunately found people look at the blueprint and they really can't comprehend, where all the numbers come from. If you told the manufacturer you wanted, quote, a low hose bed, somewhere between 62 to 64 inches off the ground, and the blueprint, which some manufacturers don't even dimension that, you say, hey, by the way, from the ground, when the rig's loaded, ground to the bottom of the hose bed in the back, what is it? And the engineer comes in and does his little thing with his CAD drawing and goes, oh yeah, it's 73 and a half. Everybody's looking at one another. Well, 73 and a half is not 66. That's the kind of stuff you need to do. And it really depends how detail-oriented you want to be. Mike and I, for years, we've always said, an educated consumer is our best customer. If you get somebody that really knows the process, that knows the expectation, we're not there to waste everybody's time. We don't need to, blow the whistle at 12:15 and say, okay, everybody out for lunch. Let's bring lunch in. We're going to keep rocking and rolling here. We don't need to go to dinner at 5:15. We're here to work. All right.
Well, I also think that some people would incorrectly think that having an uneducated customer is easier because you can guide them. That's not true, because you don't know what's in their mind. No. Having that educated customer is much more important.
Right. I used to, at one point, bemoan folks that would show up back in the day. I'm old school. I still like bringing a 3-ring binder with the old school catalogs. All right. Sure. I finally learned how to do a QR code to bring up the information. But I would always bemoan back in the day when you get to the warning light section, all right, even after the NFPA standardized that, and some guy had his favorite brand of warning lights, he had that catalog memorized, all right? That's a help to everybody because at least somebody knows exactly what they want. And to get to that point in pre-construction and having guys decide over the color or the flashing pattern of lights, that you can do that stuff ahead of time. You don't need to waste people's time. That needs to be the most valuable time. You have to think of it, I think, almost in terms, you're sitting across the table from, God bless him, an attorney, and his hourly rate's $250 an hour, and he's got a little leg timer. Every time you hear that ding, oh yeah, I bill out my time in tenths of an hour. I once had an attorney tell me that. And I'm like, that is the most valuable time that your fire department has with the people that are responsible for building your rigs. You need to make the most of it, and don't worry about what time dinner is or, where you're going after dinner, all right? If you need to work late, you work late to get all the answers there and bring the engineering disciplines in as you need them. A couple of manufacturers do that. They tell you, here's the rotation. It's like we're baking a cake, and the first guy coming in, it's going to be the guy that's setting the temperature on the oven. We need to know. That's equivalent to me of, we're going to talk about the chassis, and they bring these people in. Those kind of pre-construction conferences are great because the people get to meet face-to-face the folks that are then going to go back in their cubby hole 2 days after we leave and figure all this stuff out.
You touched on something before we go on to our next question that Bruce has here. You touched on something that I want to get both of your opinions on because you've been on the consulting side of this business. So I mentioned that someone develops that 150-page Bible, their spec, and they go out to bid with it. And one of my favorite things as a manufacturer, when I was on that side of the table, was they'll write in there, maybe somewhere at the end in legalese, it'll say, our spec rules. Like we don't care what your build spec ends up saying, our spec takes precedence. In reality, in the end, if the salesman missed something, if the engineering group missed something in your spec, going from your spec to the build spec, you may have this piece of paper that says legally our spec from the fire department holds precedence, but the truck's built wrong at this point. And now you're going to get into, in my experience, negotiations because no one has 2 or 3 more years to tear that truck apart and start from scratch. So just if you can quickly talk on any experience you have where the specs didn't match and what kind of a nightmare that can turn into.
That's for you, Tom.
Okay. I guess I've had two, why I have so little hair and what I have is gray. All right. A couple of experiences with respect to one that had to do with overall height. All right. And another one that had to do with the height of the hose bed loaded from the ground. All right. And in both cases, after running it to ground, found that engineering agreed, and oh yeah, we flubbed on that. We were, we didn't calculate the correct loaded frame to ground. In other words, dimension from the ground to the top of the frame rails when the rig was fully loaded, how much they expected the rear suspension to deflect when that rig was fully loaded. And in that case, it had to be a change at the manufacturer's expense with respect to the rear suspension, so that we could get it down to where it needed to be. And in the other case, it was the overall height that had to do from the ground to the top of the deck gun, or wagon pipe, as they call it where I live. And then we had to change to an extender gun, which, the department wasn't too happy with, but that was the only thing we could do to get the thing to go fit the firehouse. A number of years ago, Mike, when we were out, I think we were teaching an engine and truck placement class. So it wasn't necessarily with respect to how to design the rig, but we were talking about how the physical size of what you bought impacts how you operate on the fireground, how the engines and trucks work together cooperatively. And Mike said, when do you guys stop putting options on a vehicle? And no response back from the class. He goes, when you either max out the Visa Gold card or it doesn't fit the firehouse. And it was like dead silence. And I'm like, but Mike was 100% right. All right.
Yeah.
The days even before the increase in price of vehicles, it's very easy for people to say, I want a foam system, for example, something that Jason, you guys would have a tremendous amount of experience with. Well, do you want a bypass, old school bypass foam adductor to the front crosslay, to flow 120 GPM? Or are you somebody that wants to have, Class A foam out of 6 different discharges, all simultaneously, in some cases exceeding what the perceived model, you're already smiling, the model of the foam system you've identified, and then find out, well, that's great, but that system can only flow X, whatever X is, and you're already telling me you want X almost times 2, that particular system's, not going to work. So, yeah, we write into the boilerplate of EVR, just saying when we're writing a spec, that at the point of pre-construction, if you have missed a critical thing that was in our spec, and this has more for, and then not has had to do with weight, okay, where, because the again, no disrespect to the salesperson, let's put together the spec with a 21.5 front and a 27 rear, and then later on we find out engineering comes down and says, well, we really needed a 31,000 pound. Okay, who's paying for that? So those are the kinds of things, again, the due diligence up front really needs to happen. Jason made a great point. Pre-construction should really be, we've seen some things new, and now we've rethought what we wanted to do. Not that we're going in with a high left, low right, standard engine, and because we saw something that had full height, full depth compartments and now a 56-inch wide hose bed rather than 68, we all just, fell out of love and said, oh yeah, that's what we want to do. You better have a lot of money.
And here's the best part. We can tell you guys have done this before because you just led us perfectly into the next question.
Yeah, exactly.
Just try to tee it up for you, brother.
That's right. Yeah, perfect. So, committees, they can be constructed in different ways, and some have more power than the others. So let's walk through the ideal committee, who should be on that, what skills they should have, and in your opinion, what works best.
I'll try this, Tom, but I could get in trouble. I don't know.
Okay, go ahead.
What we have found, 4 to 7, 5 be optimum. There should be somebody on the committee that's going to drive the truck at some point in time. You may want to have an officer or a firefighter that's going to work off the truck. That would be helpful. If the department has a mechanic, that's probably the key man to have on it, because I know when we designed trucks for the city of New York, we had a couple of people from the maintenance shops that were there, and they had a really good handle on, okay, this component has been crapping out. We need to try and figure out a different component that will work maybe better, that we won't have so much downtime with that component. And so they became instrumental in keeping in-service time up and reducing components that tend to fail, and replace them with more reliable components to keep us in service. So those were three people. And, you can have somebody that's had experience do it, whatever that is, although that tends to be rare, particularly if you're in a volunteer firehouse that you buy a truck every 5 or 10 years. What's changed in the last 10 years in putting a spec together and building a fire truck? And it would probably be a better question to ask, what hasn't changed, before you do that. But I think everybody on that committee, and we're finding people with silver gray hair like Tom and I that sit on these committees, and we're constantly asking them, and it kind of dovetails to everything that we've done so far. And the question that you have to sit and ask yourself is, who's going to drive this truck? Particularly after we're all dead and gone. Okay. What experience level do they have? Many people, I remember joining the volunteers in 74. We had 19 people on the driver's list. 17 of them had CDLs, and 13 of them drove truck for a living. We didn't have to worry about the truck or getting them out or who was going to drive it or if it was safe. Today, you have young people that are more akin to having a gaming controller in their hand and familiar with a Toyota Corolla that weighs all the 2,000 pounds if you had the 500 pounds of rust up in the trunk. I mean, that's where we're at. And often we go to places, hey, Chief, how many drive the 190-inch wheelbase engine? Oh, I got 22. How many drive the 102-foot rear mount Grumman tower that's 54 feet long? 6. And I had 2 of my all-stars, and I just turned over on the engine and asked them if they wanted to get turned over on the truck. And what did they tell me? Absolutely not. Did not want to be responsible for something that big and that heavy. Had no interest in that at all. So I think it's really important to keep in mind before you ever put pencil to paper, okay, to determine if you have a bunch of gray-haired, silver-haired guys like us putting this truck together, you need to remember that you're not going to be there forever. And what are you leaving as your legacy to the fire department? Is it going to be something that's going to sit all the time because everybody's intimidated and afraid to drive it? Or have you put something together that's more meaningful, that's going to respond?
Tom, you have anything you want to expand on with that?
No, I agree with Mike. With the 5 people, most importantly, there 2 things. There needs to be somebody there that is technically going to take notes. All right. And whether it's in the long verbiage spec or the component list, somebody that takes detailed notes during the meeting. All right. So that when you get the change order back, you have something to go by and not just memory as to what was said or what the decision was made. The other thing is that there needs to be somebody, hopefully on the committee, that is empowered or is going to be responsible for going back to whoever the caretakers are, the stakeholders back in the department, to authorize the monetary changes. Since the days of doing a pre-construction conference where you're going to go out and it's net zero, or that you're going to come back with money in your pocket, that may happen anymore. But we have had situations where the committee goes out and they just make all the changes willy-nilly, and then they need to go back to, whether it's a board, depending on how your fire department and your community is set up, to need to go back to a board of directors in New York State, or to be a board of fire commissioners. In some cases, if it's a village, you need to go back to the village fathers or the village administrator, and it'll be like, hey, we signed a contract for, $1.25 million for this pumper. There's no contingency fund, right? You should have thought about that ahead of time, that it's very easy to make changes, but very difficult then to come and pony up the money unless your system accommodates that up front.
So leading right into that, pre-construction conferences, we touched on this a little bit already. I know traditionally, going back, let's say before COVID, we could probably refer to a lot of things in the apparatus industry anymore as pre-COVID and post-COVID. So before COVID, for the most part, your lead time was a year, year and a half, maybe 2 years on an aerial device. And you'd write the spec, you'd go to bid, and then probably somewhere in that 60 to 90 days after you awarded the bid, you'd go to the factory and you do your pre-con. Now we're looking at 3 to 4 year lead times at the earliest on some of these rigs. I'm sure, I know from being in the industry, some OEMs handle it differently. From your perspective as a consultant who's writing these specs, when do you think the best time is to have pre-con and why?
Well, I guess I'll jump in first. If I had the ability to dial into that time frame from the customer standpoint, that 60 to 90 day window would be best for a couple of reasons. Number one, everybody's still engaged in the process. Remember what they wanted. A minimum amount of time has lapsed for you, save a couple of national conferences that you may have attended, for things dramatically to change from a technology standpoint. Most importantly, you would hope that within that window, but again, that still could vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, and they respectively, hold the cards on this, that the old adage used to be, let's say, we'll make this up fictitiously. You had a rig that had 5 slide trays on the rig, and you knew up front the slide trays were worth $750, right? At the pre-construction conference, you decide you only need 4, or conversely, you really need 1 more. You would expect that price additively or coming off as a credit to come on and off at that same $750 price, right? With the vacillation in component cost that the manufacturer can't control, manufacturer can control their labor costs and a little bit of their material costs, but not a whole lot, because all the other components, they're being purchased from outside vendors. Gone are the good old days where if you would have bought a Mac CF, before they stopped building them in 1984, and a good friend Glenn Usden owns the last one built, right, where Mac built the frame, the axles, the drivetrain, the engine transmission. They did body work, and they bought a waterless pump, and they outsourced the water tank. Other than that, there was a high leveraged amount of manufacturer, locally supplied and sourced components. That's not the way the industry is today. So if you have to wait, say, 8 to 10 months or 12 months before the rig is actually going to start construction at the 2.5 or 3 year mark, understandably, there's been price increases. The manufacturer, when you get to pre-construction, let's say 30 months after contract, you might not know what the new cost of those components are if you want to add or subtract to the device. And if you see something that you hadn't thought about before, but you want to put on, that's going to go on at the 2028 price. They're not going to put that on there at the price you would have paid at the time of the contract. It just makes sense. The manufacturer needs to be able to stay in business. So unfortunately, because of the long lead times, Jason and Bruce, I only know of 2 manufacturers that today still will have you out basically as quickly as their internal process would allow you to do that. Just about everybody else, you're going to be out there T plus X number of days. And again, if you enter into a contract with a manufacturer, you want to ask that up front. What's your process? Don't wait till the president of the fire company inks the contract to ask. All of these questions are legitimate, but if someone hasn't been engaged in the process, you need, again, to become that educated consumer, to say, what is your process? If your pre-construction conference is going to be out 28 months from now, what access do we have to be able to validate that if we come up with something that we hadn't thought about, maybe we had 3 2.5-inch discharges out the back. All right. We might want a 4th. We'll ask them up front, what's today's cost? If we were to punch that 4th one out. And if you really want to do it, you probably ought to be doing it now and not wait for the point of pre-construction. I appreciate the fact that manufacturers want to wait, because 3 or 4 years from now, again, warning lights, scene lights, the different products that you gentlemen represent. I mean, there's stuff that's in the development stage. It's going to be introduced 2 years from now. If my pre-construction conference is 34 months from now, I'm going to want the latest thing you folks have to offer, not the one
For
you
sure.
say, that's the legacy component. Yeah, we still might be able to get it, but I want the new improved Tide. I don't want the 4-year-old one. And it complicates the process for everybody. And unfortunately, it makes it much more difficult for the manufacturer to build the rig. And again, it makes you that one person that's kind of the gatekeeper, that's got the old school 3-ring binder with everything printed out, including the change orders and all the emails. I'd much rather deal with somebody like that rather than somebody thumbing through their cell phone saying, hey, I remember that he sent me an email back about 18 months ago. I'm looking for it.
Nobody, I think everyone's afraid to talk about money at times. And let's face the facts. This is a business for everyone. None of these manufacturers can just build trucks and stay in business if they're not turning a profit. They have to. And you as the end user, you don't want to see them getting rich by any means, but you want to see them turn a profit, because if they don't turn a profit, what happens? Tom, you were an American LaFrance guy for a long time. What happened when American LaFrance went away? People with brand new trucks now are sitting going, how do I service this truck? How do I take care of it?
How valuable is your warranty?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
it became worthless overnight.
Yep. For listeners, this is really, Jason, was this the best parallel that I could think of? Back about 12 years ago, my wife and I, we moved down from Western New York. We built a house here outside of Winchester, Virginia. So I said, if you were to go to a builder today, all right, coming in nice time in spring here in Virginia, and you said, hey, I'm thinking I want to add on to my garage. I want to buy a pickup truck that my garage currently doesn't handle, and I'm going to buy an antique Firetruck. So I need a new 2-bay extension to my garage. And you'd ask the builder, say, well, how far backlogged are you out? Oh, I got 8 months worth of work. So, hey, I couldn't start it until probably sometime early to mid fall. And if you said to the guy, well, give me a price, and the guy worked up a price, and after he gives you the price, you come back and he'd say, well, do you want to sign a contract? Oh, no, something happened. We're probably going to do it a year from now. So is that price still going to be good if I have you build it in fall of 2027, not fall of 2026? And the builder would say, your custom builder couldn't say, I can't predict what my material costs are going to be 2 years out from now. That's exactly the way the apparatus industry is now. They can control part of their cost and know what their labor costs are going to be. But who's to know, particularly with what's going on recently with material cost and tariffs, all right, and the cost of raw material, whether your favorite body material is aluminum or stainless steel, who's to know? Back in the day when I worked at Salisbury, we had annual 1-year contracts with the material suppliers, all right? I talk to people, smaller vendors in the industry now, and they're saying to me, when we get a quote, it's net 30 days, not 31, not 32, not 33. All right. No different than, discounts for material. So it puts everybody in a very precarious position that the manufacturing segment needs to forecast and try to crystal ball what their costs are going to be 3 years from now. I don't envy them, for that. And if you think about anything else that you'd want to go buy, as a consumer, you can't go down to your favorite car dealer and go, hey, I'm thinking about buying a car, but I'm going to order the model year in 2027, not 2026. What should I plan for? They're going to look at you and laugh and say, come back in October 2027 when the new models roll out, and we'll tell you.
And there's so many layers that roll into that. So, Bruce and I work on the vendor side. We've got to pick a number. We've got a light today, and let's say it costs $1,000. You go out to bid today for brand XYZ truck, and they look and they go, oh, you wanted this light from FRC and it's $1,000. But they're not buying it today because they don't want it to sit on a shelf for 3 years.
Right.
And they don't know what it's going to cost 3 years from now when they go to build it. And unfortunately, I can't tell them what it's going to cost 3 years from now. So they're taking a guess. And of course, they're adding a little on to, hopefully they're using a formula and they're going, well, their average, they go up 3 to 6% each year and they're adding that on, but a tariff comes in, material costs go through the roof. We bounce that price up and there's no protection there. That's the unfortunate reality in this industry today.
Yeah, it is a very good point, Jason. Back in the day at big shows like we just came back from, not only could you get catalogs, you used to be able to get printed price lists. All right, somewhat showing my age. That then when Mike and I will be working with a customer, you say, well, that's a list price, but at least you'd have something to guide them. I'm not smart enough to know what all the different makes and models of phone systems would be. There's people today, there's probably folks back in there, between the purchasing group, all right, and the engineering group to kind of work cooperatively to say, okay, if we're thinking of changing something, here's where we need to go just based on what raw material costs are being. So before you go truck out to decide you want to go do this to where we know this material is going to have to be imported into the country, where's it coming from and how's that going to, upstart, what the final cost of the product could be. It can look great, but at some point, I'd have to say, I'm more than surprised that even with the price increases, that most of the departments that Michael and I have worked with, again, outside of the large fleets that are really struggling because they needed to buy 8 engines and now they only got enough money to buy 5 or 6, and they got to Band-Aid a couple others to get them over the finish line. People really haven't slowed down their thoughts as to what they want on a fire truck. I'm not sure when it's finally going to get to the breaking point that somebody says, okay, ladies and gentlemen, you've spent your allowance for the month. You maxed out Dad's Visa Gold card. Nothing else. That's it. I haven't seen people dial into that yet, but it's got to be coming pretty darn soon.
Yeah, so, as we shift here, there's a lot of things to consider at pre-con. I think we've done a great job. You guys have done a great job of laying that out and just the scope of what really goes into it. But, okay, we're at pre-con. Give me the top 3 things that you have to prioritize. So when you're done with it, you come out of it, you're like, we, nailed these 3 things for sure. And I know that's going to be hard to summarize, but if you each could give your
vehicle
top
weight, you gotta have the vehicle weight. We're going and doing fleet evaluations, and we're finding brand new trucks that are overweight. And whether it's the vendor that picked the wrong chassis, or whether it's the fire department that didn't fully explain their tool and equipment caps that they were going to put on the truck, but overweight trucks they're pervasive through the industry. Probably close to 30% or more of the trucks that we do fleet evaluations on are overweight. So that's...
I was going to write it on a piece of paper and hold it up after you said it, because I could have predicted you were going to say the vehicle weight.
Right. And not only is it overweight, but Jason and I years ago did a presentation, and Jason did an amazing PowerPoint that actually showed weight distribution. So it's just not a matter of telling them what weight you're going to put on, where are you going to put it? Okay. Are you going to put all your weight after the rear axle and offload the front axle? That's not very good. So the truck needs to be, as I've learned doing this, the truck needs to be in balance. Okay. It's going to work better. It's going to brake better. It's going to have more in-service time. It's going to handle better. People are going to be more likely to drive it because of the way that it handles, because much like NASCAR, races are won or lost on a quarter pound of air pressure because of the balance of the cars. Same thing with the fire truck. Okay, if you get equipment on one side or the other, or you get the truck out of balance, it's going to be a beast to drive down the road. I think that for me, that's one of the big 3.
No, and it's a great analogy. In NASCAR, we're talking about a little bit of air pressure being a couple $1 million of winning or losing a race. In a fire truck, we're talking about weight balance becoming life and death if someone wrecks that truck.
Right. There are several wrecks that I know of. It didn't make the headline that the truck was overweight, but there was a lieutenant in Boston that was killed, and that truck was overweight the minute that somebody signed the paper and said, I want this. because I know what they carried on their trucks, the same thing that we carried in New York. And the truck was overweight right from the start. And so you would have to take each accident and do the peel back the onion routine to find out the really root cause. But, the spectacular headline is that fire truck wrecks and rolls over, or fire truck loses brakes. Well, in this day and age, trucks don't really lose brakes anymore. There has to be a causative factor to that. What really happened with this truck? And of course, overweight trucks don't necessarily make for a great headline either. So, but there's a lot of them out there. They cost a lot of money too.
Yeah.
Okay. I remember driving in New York when we had single axle ladder trucks. They had literally, and I think Tom might have even seen this, they had pallets of springs in the shops because they would break springs. My truck was a great truck, but it went in for brakes and springs every 9 months to a year. I mean, it was just a matter of course. And that's because the trucks were overweight, seriously overweight. So it becomes an in-service time. It becomes a component issue. It becomes a repair cost issue. It's the weight's a big deal.
So Tom, Mike's throwing out weight distribution. You got room for us?
Yeah. If to go to Bruce's point, for me personally, the next two, first thing, we're just under the blanket of safety. All right, safe stepping surfaces are around the vehicle, safe access into the hose bed area. If you're on a rescue engine or a rescue truck and it's got top coffin compartments, safe access up there. You're not expecting people to climb up 7 oddly shaped, steps that are on 18-inch centers. All right. And hopefully going to be able to latch onto something on the top.
To access their heaviest equipment that they store.
Yeah, exactly. All right. And then the third thing was having the equipment list and the compartmentation on the rig well dialed in. If it's an engine company and we're there to move water, we've got the right components on there to do it. Days of, I think our experience has been with people doing combination rigs, whether it's a quint or a rescue engine. You go back and take the pulse of those people later on, particularly if it's a rescue engine where they took a standard, whatever their description of a heavy rescuer, Maryland's called a rescue squad, and combine that and put that into an engine company, and you say, how's the rig working out? And they won't say it in front of the chief or the people that were responsible for buying it, but they'll say, it's not really a good engine. It's too big. It's tough to work off of. And as far as rescue stuff goes, other than basic stabilization and a door pop, we still got a special, other companies in. So it's designing the vehicle to meet the mission and then having everybody on board that, if your rig needs to be that 33 feet and 6 inches, then fine. Understand that that's the tour of duty that you signed up for. Amplify Mike's point about drivers. Just the other day, I was talking with somebody, and they told me when they went on the job, and this was in a career fire department back a good number of years ago, you got turned over on the ladder truck first because they said it would be easier to operate because there wasn't anything to do with the pump or hydraulics, which I know would make Brother Wilbur very happy because you don't have to know any of that really, really important stuff. All right, but they actually started out on the larger unit because they figured that it was somehow less complex. I don't know. You still need to be attuned as to how you're going to position the rig when you get there. But, the fire service has been evolving, and it does concern me when you go into a department, even if it's very well run and managed, and they go, we're an all hazards agency. The days of the fire department just being called out to an EMS call or to be put out because we actually have a fire. It's not just alarm bells. It's not, a smoke detector going off. We need to design our apparatus to be appropriate for the mission. And if we can do that and have an appropriate sized committee with folks that are conversant on the manufacturer's process, and if that process doesn't meet, it's kind of like going to a restaurant. If you don't like the way the restaurant prepares the food, you don't go back there. Well, if that's the way the manufacturer, has his system set up, you need to tell them what your expectations are. And to go to Mike's issue on weight and things, you need to lay that out in front. You can't just jump that on them when you come in there and they go, well, the engineering will look at that weight, after we do the pre-construction. Wrong. That's not what we're here for. So hopefully we covered a bunch of the different topics you had. Again, it's a complex in purchasing environment, and the fact that you don't have to write the spec anymore, or you didn't write the spec, just doesn't magically make it easier to get to the goal line.
I think the watchword is that buyer, be educated. Okay, the more knowledge is power. The more that you know about the process and about what you're doing, the better off you're going to be, and the better the final product's going to be. Ask questions. You got to ask questions. There's no silly questions. You need to ask a lot of questions to make sure that you get it dialed in.
Great point, gentlemen. We have covered some awesome topics here. We've covered some great information. I would love to maybe look to get some time in the future to have you back, because I think we could do a podcast talking about midpoint inspections and final, and what to expect and what to dive into on those type of inspections. With that said, I'll let Bruce wrap up with our closing comments here.
Yeah, again, thank you guys for your time. There's just a wealth of information in the past hour, and I think there's a lot of great nuggets that our listeners can take out of it. So again, this has been another episode of Rig Recon Live. You can catch the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube. Follow us on social media at Rig Recon, and visit our website, rigrecon.com, for all the latest apparatus content. Until then, spec the best.